Imagine an emperor so obsessed with surrounding himself with beautiful young men that he created a secret selection process rivaling any royal harem, handpicking boys from across the empire based on criteria so specific that only the most perfectly sculpted specimens could hope to gain entry to his inner circle. Picture a ruler who spent more time cataloging the physical attributes of potential male companions than governing the most powerful empire in the ancient world, transforming the imperial palace into a showcase of masculine beauty that served his personal pleasures rather than state interests. This is the hidden story of Nero's secret harem, a carefully curated collection of young men whose selection revealed the emperor's psychological obsessions and whose presence at court demonstrated how far Roman imperial power had drifted from its republican origins into pure personal indulgence. Before we uncover the selection secrets of history's most aesthetically obsessed emperor, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Nero's story shows how unlimited power can transform leadership into an art collection of human beings. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus ascended to the throne of the Roman Empire in 54 AD at the age of 16, bringing with him artistic sensibilities and aesthetic obsessions that would transform the imperial court from a center of political power into a carefully curated gallery of human beauty designed to satisfy his increasingly sophisticated tastes in masculine perfection. Unlike previous emperors who had maintained male lovers as casual diversions, Nero approached the acquisition and maintenance of beautiful young men with the same systematic intensity that other rulers devoted to military campaigns or architectural projects. The emperor's selection criteria for his male companions reflected a sophisticated understanding of classical beauty standards combined with personal preferences that had been shaped by his artistic education and his exposure to Greek cultural ideals during his formative years. Nero sought young men who embodied the physical perfection celebrated in classical sculpture, with proportioned features, athletic builds, and the kind of androgynous beauty that could serve as living embodiments of the aesthetic principles he admired in art and literature. Sporus, a young freedman who bore a striking resemblance to Nero's deceased wife, Poppaea Sabina, became the most famous and influential member of the emperor's collection when Nero encountered him at a theater performance and was immediately captivated by his delicate features and natural grace. The emperor's decision to have Sporus castrated and formally married to him in a public ceremony revealed both the depth of his aesthetic obsession and his complete disregard for traditional Roman concepts of appropriate imperial behavior. The recruitment process for Nero's harem involved agents who traveled throughout the empire with detailed instructions about the specific physical and personality traits that would appeal to the emperor's refined tastes. These recruiters were given access to slave markets, theatrical troupes, athletic competitions, and noble households where they could identify young men who met Nero's exacting standards for beauty, intelligence, and cultural sophistication. The emperor's daily routine increasingly revolved around the aesthetic appreciation and personal enjoyment of his collection, with elaborate ceremonies designed to showcase their beauty and artistic accomplishments. Morning audiences with government officials were frequently interrupted or canceled so that Nero could spend time with his favorites, while important state business was delayed in favor of poetry readings, musical performances, and other cultural activities that allowed the emperor to display his companions' talents. The Roman elite's reaction to Nero's obvious prioritization of aesthetic pleasure over political responsibility reflected the growing tension between traditional republican values and the unlimited personal indulgence that had become characteristic of imperial rule. Senators and military commanders who had once served emperors, committed to expanding Roman power and influence, found themselves dealing with a ruler whose primary concern was surrounding himself with beautiful objects and people that pleased his artistic sensibilities. The financial resources devoted to maintaining Nero's collection of young men exceeded the budgets of entire provinces, as the emperor spared no expense in housing, clothing, educating, and entertaining his favorites in ways that reflected both their value to him personally and their status as symbols of his refined taste and unlimited wealth. The psychological dynamics that developed between Nero and his carefully selected companions created a unique form of court culture where aesthetic appreciation, sexual gratification, and political influence intersected in ways that had never been seen before in Roman imperial history. The systematic approach that Nero developed for identifying and acquiring the most beautiful young men in the Roman Empire revealed both his sophisticated understanding of classical aesthetics and his transformation of imperial power into a tool for personal gratification rather than political achievement. The emperor's agents operated throughout the Mediterranean world with specific guidelines that reflected Nero's particular preferences and his desire to create a living collection that would rival the greatest artistic achievements of Greek and Roman civilization. The physical standards that governed selection for Nero's inner circle were precise and unforgiving, based on measurements and proportions that had been derived from classical sculptures and artistic treatises that the emperor studied obsessively. Candidates were evaluated for facial symmetry, body proportions, skin quality, hair texture, and overall presence, with only those who met every criterion being considered worthy of imperial attention. Pythagoras, a young Greek athlete from Corinth, exemplified the type of young man who caught Nero's attention when imperial scouts identified him during the Olympic Games of 61 AD. His combination of physical perfection, athletic achievement, and cultural sophistication made him an ideal candidate for inclusion in the emperor's collection, while his Greek heritage added the exotic appeal that Nero particularly valued in his companions. The recruitment methods employed by Nero's agents ranged from straightforward purchase in slave markets to elaborate negotiations with noble families who were offered substantial rewards for allowing their sons to serve the emperor in his personal household. The most desirable candidates often required complex arrangements involving political favors, land grants, and social advancement for their families, as parents recognized both the opportunities and dangers inherent in their children's selection for imperial service. The education and preparation process that followed selection was designed to maximize each young man's value as both aesthetic object and cultural companion, with training in music, poetry, rhetoric, and other accomplishments that would allow them to entertain the emperor and his guests while serving their primary function as living examples of masculine beauty. This education was provided by the finest tutors available and spared no expense in developing talents that would enhance their appeal. The hierarchy that developed within Nero's collection reflected both the emperor's personal preferences and the political dynamics that inevitably emerged when multiple individuals competed for the attention and favor of an absolute ruler. Sporus occupied the highest position due to his resemblance to Poppaea and his formal marriage to the emperor, while others were ranked according to their physical appeal, artistic accomplishments, and ability to maintain Nero's interest over time. The living conditions provided for members of Nero's harem exceeded those of most Roman nobles, with luxurious quarters, expensive clothing, personal servants, and access to the finest food, entertainment, and cultural activities that the empire could provide. These material comforts served both to maintain their physical beauty and to demonstrate the emperor's wealth and sophisticated taste to visitors who witnessed the splendor of the imperial household. The psychological impact of selection for Nero's collection varied dramatically among the young men involved, with some embracing the opportunities for advancement and luxury, while others struggled with the loss of personal autonomy and the constant pressure to maintain their physical appeal and the emperor's interest in their companionship. Daily existence within Nero's carefully curated collection of beautiful young men was a complex mixture of unprecedented luxury and complete subjugation, as members of the emperor's harem enjoyed material comforts that exceeded those of most Roman citizens, while surrendering any pretense of personal autonomy or freedom to pursue their own interests and relationships. The elaborate routines that governed their lives were designed to maintain their physical perfection while ensuring their constant availability for the emperor's aesthetic and personal pleasure. The morning rituals that began each day for Nero's favorites involved extensive grooming procedures that could take several hours to complete, with specialized servants responsible for bathing, massaging, hairstyling, and the application of cosmetics designed to enhance their natural beauty and maintain the standards that had originally qualified them for imperial selection. These procedures were conducted with the same attention to detail that other wealthy Romans devoted to preparing valuable artworks for display. Sporus, as the most favored member of the collection, underwent the most elaborate preparation rituals, including the application of feminine cosmetics and the wearing of women's clothing when Nero wanted to emphasize his resemblance to the deceased Poppaea Sabina. His daily routine included not only personal grooming, but also lessons in feminine behavior and deportment that would enhance his effectiveness in fulfilling the emperor's psychological needs. The educational activities that occupied much of their time were designed to develop the cultural accomplishments that made them valuable as companions rather than merely aesthetic objects. Poetry composition, musical performance, rhetorical training, and philosophical discussion were all part of a curriculum intended to create well-rounded individuals who could entertain the emperor and his guests, while maintaining their primary function as living embodiments of masculine beauty. The social dynamics within the harem were complex and often competitive, as young men who had been selected for their individual appeal found themselves competing for the emperor's attention and favor in ways that could determine their future status and security. Friendships and alliances formed among members of the group, but these relationships were always secondary to their individual relationships with Nero and their understanding that their position depended entirely on maintaining his interest. The public appearances that members of Nero's collection were required to make at state functions, theatrical performances, and social gatherings served multiple purposes, allowing the emperor to display his refined taste and unlimited wealth while providing entertainment for guests and demonstrating the extent of his power to collect and maintain the most beautiful young men in the empire. The private moments that Nero spent with his favorites revealed the psychological complexity of his relationships with them, as the emperor sought not just physical gratification, but emotional connection and artistic inspiration from young men who represented his idealized vision of masculine beauty and cultural sophistication. These intimate encounters combined elements of genuine affection with the inherent power imbalance that characterized all relationships between the emperor and his subjects. The isolation experienced by members of the harem from normal Roman society created unique psychological pressures, as young men who had once enjoyed normal relationships and social connections found themselves cut off from their previous lives and dependent entirely on the emperor's favor for their security, status, and sense of personal worth within the artificial world of the imperial palace. The collapse of Nero's reign in 68 AD brought sudden and devastating consequences for the young men who had comprised his carefully curated collection of masculine beauty, as the emperor's suicide during the Civil War that ended his rule left his former favorites without protection from the political enemies who viewed them as symbols of the decadence and misrule that had characterized the final years of Julio-Claudian power. Their fate revealed the ultimate vulnerability of those who had achieved status and security through personal relationships with absolute rulers rather than through merit or political alliance. Sporus, who had been elevated to the highest position within Nero's harem through his formal marriage to the emperor, faced particular danger as the most visible symbol of the sexual and political excesses that had made Nero's rule infamous throughout the Roman world. His castration and feminine presentation made him a living reminder of behaviors that the new regime wanted to erase from public memory, while his intimate knowledge of imperial secrets made him a potential threat to those who had participated in the conspiracy against Nero. The immediate aftermath of Nero's death saw various members of his collection attempting to flee Rome, or seek protection from powerful patrons who might shield them from the retribution that typically followed the fall of imperial dynasties. Some succeeded in escaping to distant provinces, where their connection to the deceased emperor was less well known, while others found themselves abandoned by former allies who no longer wished to be associated with Nero's memory or his controversial lifestyle. Emperor Galba, who briefly succeeded Nero, initially showed some clemency toward the former emperor's household members, but political pressure from senators and military commanders who wanted to demonstrate their complete rejection of Neronian decadence led to increasingly harsh treatment of anyone associated with the previous regime's excesses. The young men who had once been prized for their beauty and cultural accomplishments found themselves viewed as embarrassing reminders of imperial corruption. The subsequent reign of Otho brought a temporary reprieve for some of Nero's former favorites, particularly Sporus, whom the new emperor took as his own companion, demonstrating how the imperial system's fundamental problems transcended individual rulers and continued to corrupt those who achieved absolute power. However, Otho's brief rule and violent death meant that this protection was short-lived and ultimately meaningless. Vitellius, who gained power after Otho's defeat, proved far less tolerant of Nero's surviving associates and ordered the elimination of several prominent members of the former emperor's household, including Sporus, whose death represented the final destruction of Nero's aesthetic vision and the complete rejection of the values that had guided his approach to imperial rule. The broader historical legacy of Nero's harem system influenced subsequent emperors' approaches to personal relationships and court culture, with most choosing to avoid the kind of obvious aesthetic obsessions that had made Nero vulnerable to criticism and political opposition. The cautionary tale of beautiful young men who had been elevated to extraordinary heights, only to be destroyed when political circumstances changed, became part of the informal education that ambitious Romans received about the dangers of becoming too closely associated with imperial personal indulgences. The destruction of Nero's collection represented not just the end of individual lives, but the systematic erasure of an entire approach to imperial culture that had prioritized aesthetic achievement and personal gratification over traditional Roman values of military virtue and political competence. The next time you see artistic depictions of Roman imperial grandeur, remember the beautiful young men whose lives were consumed as aesthetic objects in Nero's pursuit of perfect beauty. Their story reminds us that even the most refined cultural achievements can mask fundamental cruelty when human beings become collectibles for those with unlimited power. If this exploration of how aesthetic obsession can corrupt leadership fascinated you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold stories of power transformed into personal indulgence, and hit that notification bell, because understanding how civilizations can prioritize beauty over humanity offers crucial lessons about the dangers of unchecked authority. What other historical rulers do you think confused artistic patronage with human exploitation? Share your thoughts in the comments below.